helps me with lots of papers.
Would you like another mic?
Yes, please. Great. Over to Lord Lilley, please.
Right. I thought this was just questions and answers, but I'm happy to talk. I can't talk about the papers, I can't talk about the archives, I can talk about having worked in a humble capacity initially for her before I ever got into Parliament, and subsequently when, so both in opposition and when she was during her first period as Prime Minister. I didn't get into Parliament in '83, and then subsequently working with her in government and in her cabinet. The thing that I found most memorable was her determination to challenge anything you put to her. So initially I was brought to her attention by Geoffrey Howe, for whom I used to write speeches, and he handed me over to do the same, write speeches and policy papers for her. Anything that I said, that I put down on paper, that I thought would be really appealing to her basic prejudices and everything, she would nonetheless tear into. And that, first of all, took me by surprise, but I discovered that if you came back and had counter-arguments and so on, she respected you. What she wanted was to be sure that even things she liked were robust enough to be adopted as policy. That continued throughout the period I worked for her in opposition. Then I got into Parliament in 1983. You'll hear a bit more of this from Neil Hamilton, who's going to talk about the No Turning Back group. But we formed the No Turning Back group. We wrote a pamphlet together on education policy. We sent it to her and asked her to come and discuss it with a group of her most ardent supporters, the No Turning Back group, and she came and had supper with us, and she tore into this pamphlet. She asked questions, she made points, she ridiculed arguments. We come back, because we thought quite deeply about it. She counter-attacked and so on. And eventually she went away, and my colleagues, none of whom had actually worked with her before, were dismayed. They said, it's true what people say. She's rude, she's aggressive, she doesn't listen. I said, no, we won the argument. They said, makes it worse, she didn't even listen when we were winning the argument. I said, no, we've won the argument. She's now going back and she's giving absolute hell to the people who briefed her. And sure enough, our policies almost entirely became government policy in due course. So she does listen. She doesn't necessarily appear to be listening, because it's more important to her to challenge what is being said than to make the person saying it feel loved and accepted. And that was the big difference between her and, say, Willie Whitelaw. Willie Whitelaw would have put his arm around you and say, Peter, that's a really important point. I'm glad you made it. I don't think we can quite adopt it at the moment, but nonetheless, and you'd feel loved. So she was different in that way from him, but of course she was wise enough to employ him in her cabinet as the emollient and wise advisor. The other thing that I recall about her was that the less important you were, the nicer she was to you. Later on, I had a little office when I was PPS to the Chancellor. I had a little office between the Chancellor's office and the Prime Minister's office. And she would come in on Tuesdays and Thursdays to prepare for Prime Minister's questions. And the largely West Indian guards on of her room absolutely loved her, because she remembered them. She would ask how the children were doing at school, the wife's birthday, everything. She was really considerate about them. Before I ever got into Parliament, I was summoned one day to help with a speech, not a very important one, that she was going to give. She'd been in, I think, Mexico. She'd been travelling for 3 days and hadn't really slept, and even she was getting tetchy and irritable after so little sleep. She came into the room, she didn't see me, she saw Geoffrey Howe waiting for her. He had done something in her absence, I forget what, put up interest rates or something wicked, and she considered wicked. And she laid into him, and Geoffrey, why have you done this? And really tore him to shreds. And then she suddenly saw me and said, Peter, you shouldn't have heard any of that. And but then noticed I was wearing a black tie because I'd been to my aunt's funeral that morning. And she said, "Why are you wearing a black tie?" I said, "I've been to my aunt's funeral." And immediately she changed from being this harridan attacking her closest, most senior colleague to maternal solicitude for me that possibly I was too upset, and if I couldn't help writing the speech, you'd have to write the blasted thing herself or find someone else. And the contrast between how she treated important people to unimportant people was, I think, immensely to her credit. And there are other people in Parliament or in government I've known who were precisely the reverse of that, and I shan't name them. So those are the two things I remember most about dealing with her challenging determination to find out what was right, the weaknesses, and challenge every conceivable weakness in what you had to say, and her kindness to those who are less important. One final thing, she did nonetheless retain although she loved arguing and she blurt things out and so on in cabinet and cabinet committees, she did retain a sense of hierarchy. So a couple of things I had, when I became Economic Secretary to the Treasury, because I dealt with the energy industry in my professional life, I was put in charge of oil taxation, among other things, and I'd written a paper saying that it was absurd that we gave away North Sea oil blocks to oil companies. We ought to auction them, which seemed to me a sensible policy, raise money, allocate them more efficiently, and so on. And so I read the paper this, and she summoned me in and asked me to debate this with Cecil Parkinson, who was the Energy Secretary. And I debated it with him, and I thought I quite clearly won the argument. And I went away, and a message came through my private office saying the Prime Minister was very grateful to you for putting those arguments so effectively, but she hopes you will realise she cannot rule in your favour against a Secretary of State. The other was when I was in Cabinet, much later, and I can't even remember what the issue was, but the Foreign Secretary had said something ridiculous, and I had disagreed with it. And she immediately sided with me, and then realised that this was a bit, I was the youngest, just junior, newest member of the Cabinet, and there was Douglas Hurd with all his experience. And so she said, "Well, we obviously ought to listen to Peter because he's got a house in France, but obviously..." and then realised that wasn't convincing enough, and immediately went off and said, "I have often thought of getting a house in France myself, but we haven't got time," and so I just sort of dismissed the whole issue and left the Foreign Secretary in charge of the field. So those three things I remember about her. Is that enough?
Perfect. Thank you. Now we have Professor Tooley.
Thank you very much. Look, I know we're English, so to avoid embarrassment, this nose has got nothing to do with my estranged wife. I met Michael Heseltine in the lift. And before I get started, I take my hat off, as I'm sure all of us here do, to Donal Laney. He's understood there is a market. I didn't know this, did you? There's a market for people to come together on a Monday morning in Cambridge to talk about Margaret Thatcher. That is extraordinary. So I not only know Donal as a superb lawyer, but he's got the sense of this market. So Donal, I think we should. Look, I could listen to Peter all day about this, and I feel a bit of a fake on the platform, because what I'm offering, I suppose, is not personal recollections, not the personal sense there, but just want to acknowledge Margaret from my own university, in a capacity as the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Buckingham. At the opening address on February the 6th, 1976, Margaret said, "I am here because I believe in an ideal, and ideals are meant to be lived, not read about in history books." The ideal was one of educational freedom, educational independence, and the University of Buckingham, as many of you know, was founded because colleagues at the Institute of Economic Affairs and others were worried about state encroachment on education, particularly higher education. And there was a book published by the IEA in 1969 towards an independent education, and the Committee for the Independent University was set up in the early 1970s. 1973, Margaret Thatcher joined the Board of Patrons, and then in 1976 she gave that opening speech to the university. In 1983 she successfully, or she helped get our royal charter through the Privy Council. She selected Dr. Rhodes Boyson to help us get through that. And then in 1985, when Oxford, the sister institution, when Oxford refused to give her an honorary doctorate, as they'd given every other prime minister who was an alumni of the University of Oxford, they refused. So the University of Buckingham stepped in and gave her an honorary doctorate instead, and she said this was more valuable than the University of Oxford. And then in 1992, when she'd left 10 Downing Street, she became the Chancellor of our university. The Vice-Chancellor, as you know, is the person who does all the work. The Chancellor is the figurehead, and she became our much-loved Chancellor. And I travelled the world, and alumni of the university get out their phones and show me the photograph of them shaking the hand proudly of Margaret Thatcher. One of the, Lord Luce told me a story of one of the graduands, as they're called before they become graduates. He was very much against Margaret Thatcher, and she was going to make a stand, she said. And Lord Luce, Sir Richard Luce, then the Vice-Chancellor, tried to persuade her not to. No, she was going to make the stand, and she went onto the stage and she told Margaret Thatcher, she said, "Take this hand if you dare. It's shaken the hand of Arthur Scargill." And without missing a beat, Lord Luce said, Margaret took hold of her hand with both hands, saying, "Well, dear, let's see if I can cleanse it for you." So look, as I say, Margaret Thatcher is very dear to the university. I didn't know it was that funny. I am creating the Margaret Thatcher Chair for the Constitution of Liberty. It's led to all sorts of troubles that some of you might know about. But anyway, I am creating that. Iain Hershey Ali has agreed to take that on, and we'll be announcing that very, very soon. And what I want to do is just finish on a couple of quotes. I wonder, are these papers in the Thatcher archive? We'll have to compare notes. That first line I gave you just now, "I am here because I believe in an ideal," was from a transcript of the 1976 paper, and it's not in the original. So it may be worth comparing notes to see that we have got some things in common. But let me just give you a couple of quotes. One was so we've got papers from her from 1976, when she opened the university, 1983, when the Royal Charter came, 1993, 1994, when she was the Chancellor. But let me just give you these quotes from the inaugural speech. "The inauguration of the University College of Buckingham is of more than parochial significance. It represents the first time in this century that a university has been born in this country without the central government acting as midwife. It has seemed a strange curiosity born out of its time. In the last 30 years, education has become increasingly to be a state monopoly. Nevertheless, to a free people accustomed to great richness of private initiative, there is something undesirable, indeed debilitating, about the present mood of the country," this is 1976, "in which so many people look not to themselves or their fellows for new initiative, but to the state. I, as a politician," she said, "must not prescribe to you. After all, independence, we must remember, is not a gift. It is not something that governments confer, but something that a free people enjoys and uses." And she concluded very powerfully, I think, with great resonance for today, "Unless we are worthy and able to take advantage of a freedom not yet extinguished in our land, we shall become pale shadows, like civilizations before us, who were eventually thrust aside and dispossessed by more vigorous rivals. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next up, we have Iain Dale.
I think the one thing everybody can agree on is that anybody who ever met Margaret Thatcher remembered the experience, and there's always an anecdote to tell. So let me tell you an anecdote. This session is called Knowing Margaret Thatcher. I don't profess to have known her. I met her probably, a dozen occasions. But on each occasion, there was something she did or said that I remember. And I remember in about 1995 taking an American friend of mine to meet her at the T.E. Utley Memorial Lecture, which was at the Reform Club. And he was desperate to meet her. He was a real sort of Reaganite. He was sort of 6 foot tall, very dashing, just the sort of man that she rather fancied. And so he said, how do I sort of introduce myself? I said, oh, come on. So I took him over, and I said, Lady Thatcher, would you like to meet Daniel Forrester, my friend from America? She looks him up and down, and then comes up the finger. And what a lot of people who haven't met Margaret Thatcher don't realise is how small she was. And when I first met her, I expected this sort of 6 foot woman, but it wasn't quite the case. She starts jabbing him in the chest. Says, "Your president, President Clinton, he is a great communicator. The trouble is, he has absolutely nothing to communicate." And then she just turned round and flounced off. And he was just stood there thinking, oh my God, I should remember that forever. And he has. Something I have in common with Donal, in that I like to think we are regarded as two people who are keepers of the Thatcher flame, rather like Andrew, rather like Peter, rather like probably many people in this room. And that's partly the reason why I've written this very short book. I didn't think there was a need for another biography of Margaret Thatcher after Charles Moore. I mean, who could possibly surpass that? Until I broke my hip, and my personal trainer, aged 25, when he found out what I did for a living, said, "Now, Margaret Thatcher, who was she? What did she do?" I was like horrified. So when Swift Press came to me and said, "Look, we'd like to do this series on prime ministers, would you like to do the Thatcher one?" I said, yes. And I've tried to write it in a way that is an introduction to her for generations of people who weren't alive when she was Prime Minister. You have to be 56 to have actually voted for her or against her in 1987. It's 35 years since she left office. And I think the left have been quite successful in building up narratives about Margaret Thatcher's premiership, which are just completely untrue. And the last chapter in the book is called 12 Myths. And I've tried to, it could have been 50 myths, but I picked 12 myths to try and explain to people, well, it's not quite as you think. Now, Peter gave some brilliant anecdotes about how her personal kindnesses to people. And I did an updated version of my previous book, Memories of Margaret Thatcher, in which Andrew and Peter both feature, where 250 people who worked with her, who were friends of hers, who knew her best, have written basically anecdotes about her. And there was one that really touched me, where one of her messengers, his wife, died suddenly, and she turned up at the funeral without telling anyone she was going. She slipped in, sat at the back, and then left. And only about 4 people at the funeral actually saw her there. She didn't make any fuss about it at all. And it's that sort of thing that I think was typical of her, where if it had been Tony Blair, there would have been some press reports about it to make him look good. And she just didn't act like that at all. But one of the myths that I address in here, to be serious for a moment, is about the fall of the apartheid regime in South Africa, where virtually everybody, and I've tested this out, virtually everybody thinks that she was somehow sympathetic to apartheid or was actually a racist herself. And if you look at the papers, if you look at the evidence, it's very far from the truth. It's because, obviously, she didn't agree with sanctions because she felt sanctions would hurt the very people they were trying to help. And it was a very lonely position for her, particularly at all of the Commonwealth summits. But she thought engagement with the South African regime was the best way to bring about change. And if you read the correspondence between her and the South African leadership, if you read the minutes of the meetings that were held, it's quite clear that she was adamant that there had to be change, and she thought that she was in a position as a British Prime Minister to help bring that about. And so it proved. If you read the memoirs of Robin Rennick, who was ambassador in Pretoria at the time, he goes into exhaustive detail about the meetings that she would have either in this country or in South Africa with the leadership. And I don't think this was a case of her haranguing them, but just by trying to use the gentle art of persuasion to change. In every single letter, will you please release Nelson Mandela? Yet the narrative is that she thought Mandela was a terrorist. She called the ANC a terrorist organisation, quite rightly, but I don't think there's any record of her ever calling Mandela a terrorist. And he acknowledged her role in getting him released when he came to London in July 1990 and thanked her for it. But that doesn't matter to the left, of course. And then when he came to London, he had a meeting with her, and Robin Rennick sat her down and said, "Now, Prime Minister, he's waited 30 years to have this conversation with you." And she said, "So Robin, you mean I should shut up?" Robin said, "Yes, Prime Minister." And to be fair to her, she absolutely did. And this meeting went on so long that the waiting press outside in Downing Street started chanting "Free Nelson Mandela." So it's a difficult one to try and persuade people that the facts actually demonstrate the opposite of what the narrative is. And there are so many other examples of that. And I think those of us who value what she did as Prime Minister, it's up to us to try and correct the record, which is what I hope at least that chapter in the book does.
Thank you, Iain. Now we have Andrew Riley.
Who's the last act before lunch. Probably be quick. I'll never speak with this panel again, I imagine, but I don't want to because you've all been so good. Now me. Donald, Ted, thank you. It's been a brilliant event so far. I am one of those very unimportant people that Mrs. T knew not very well, but was always incredibly nice to. Yes, it would help if you could hear me, wouldn't it? Thank you, Iain. Mark Worthington, who sort of helped run her office so splendidly in the 90s, invited me to meet her. He hadn't told me she'd be in the office that day, so it came as a very pleasant surprise. And I was saying to someone in the audience earlier, I can't remember if she actually shook hands with me, but there was this electric current that sort of ran through the room, and she sort of came to me, and yes, the finger started jabbing, and she said, sort of totally out of the blue, "What do you have about Keith?" And immediately I thought of a sort of rock and roll band and guitarists, and then realised that, no, she was talking about Keith Joseph. There was no small talk, she was just straight into it. We had our audience, and then as I left, she came closer to me and said, "Are you paid enough?" And I said, "Oh yes, thank you, you've been very generous, you're very kind." And I think I failed the test at that moment. I should have held out for more money, but college would have gone wrong. So 25 and a half years ago, I was interviewed here, I got the job, and I said to my then boss I'd stay for 2 or 3 years, and then go and sort of move on and do something more lucrative. But I just have never managed to leave, because the archive here is so compelling. We meet wonderful people. I mean, what on earth does an archivist do? I mean, we sort through, in her case, a vast archive, up to the moment she left number 10, roughly about 1 million pieces of paper. We opened that last tranche just before the first COVID lockdown. There's roughly the same quantity again for the rest of her life. We sort, we catalogue, we make available in different ways. What sort of techniques for navigating that material? Where it becomes interesting to me is where she's annotated things, where she's engaged with the content. We can play nice tricks with people who visit us in person. We can show them things they wrote a very long time ago. And of course, they know they wrote things for her, but they don't know how she received it. So here's one I found earlier. Thatcherism, the Next Generation from 1989. Brilliant book. Still available, I hope. Still in print. Charles Moore is very good in his wonderful biographies about Mrs. T's annotations, the angry presence in the margin. The squiggly line is apparently sort of death to the author, but you don't get a squiggly line. But she's underlined some choice bits. Words you use like choice. Choice gets underlined a lot. The dignity of self-reliance, that got a big underline. Ditto, the idea of subsuming Britain in a European state is profoundly repugnant. I think that's what you wrote, but she certainly engaged with that. What she doesn't do much herself is write. She has brilliant people round her. John, I hesitate to call you a wordsmith because you did much more than that. But you and your colleagues were able to frame what she was thinking in public speeches and sort of articulate it. But we have her first drafts, and I gather the speech-making process wasn't always a fun one. You probably still have the scars. But you could see the ideas she was trying to convey, and those original drafts are just fascinating when compared with the sort of polished version that comes out in public. She writes 2 or 3 things for posterity while her mind is sharp. The most interesting and detailed one, and Charles Moore again is brilliant on this, is her account of the Falklands conflict. She sits down, Easter 1983, after the Franks report is cleared, sort of clears her effectively, and writes her impressions. 128 pages, I think it's like 17,000, 18,000 words, and it's just, I mean, any normal person would have been resting over Easter or preparing for a general election campaign, but not her. She's trying to get this all down on paper. She writes a nice, fun memoir about the power politics of getting our money back at Fontainebleau, and a travel log of going to one of those sort of almost endless funerals of Russian premiers. But otherwise, she's in the margins. And I mean, this is just an idle one I found this morning. But I mean, you can see the attention to detail that never goes. She reads her boxes, but the marginalia are great. But what it sort of brings out, one of the most surprising things early on for me was actually how cautious she was. So she would read things by the likes of Geoffrey Howe, your former boss, and sort of, there's political caution there. And effectively she's saying at times on things like exchange controls, abolition of, if it goes wrong, it's on you, Geoffrey. And I mean, I know there are a team here from the Thatcher Network, a sort of parallel organisation. The most obvious thing in the archive is there are things from other people, and Mrs. Thatcher's ministers do a lot of the heavy lifting and the work of the things that we assume now to be Thatcherism, and it's how she engages with those ideas that are fascinating. And my 8 minutes is probably up as my voice is vanishing. But one of the things that's wonderful about the archive is it strips away all hindsight. You and your colleagues offer opinions, policy advice and ideas, and she scribbles and annotates. But you can't look back. It's raw and contemporary. She got some things wrong, of course she did. But the sort of political radar is very sort of refined. There's a wonderful file at the National Archive, sadly not with us, and I think it became a book about the Prime Minister's ironing board, when a new Thatcher government comes in 79 talking about cutting public spending. The civil service purchased this vastly expensive piece of ironing board, which she then has to buy, even though she didn't ask for it or want it. So, I mean, come to our archive. We're just down the hill in Churchill College. 2 million pieces of paper, mostly available. Mrs. Thatcher was adamant that anything about her should be in the public domain. The people who worked for her, she felt was sort of less attractive to their ideas, sort of being open too early. But you can come and see one of her handbags, and you can come and see her toy cat, which lived outside the door of the number 10 flat, which has a little note to history attached. But that's probably quite enough.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, now for questions. One of my favourite things about the archive, there's a long policy document, and she's hardly scribbled in it at all, apart from in the margin, and she's just written in capital letters, NATO. Just long document, just NATO. Hands up and wait for the mic for me. Who would like to ask a question to our panellists, please? Yes, please.
Thank you very much, gents. Just a small, quick-fire question. Do you think, in your personal opinions, that her mindset, her mentality, was that a result of her environment and her experiences, or do you think it was her personal nature as a state of mind?
Who would like to take that?
I think that she wasn't a fully formed politician, a fully formed leader until a little bit into her premiership. There was no such thing as Thatcherism in 1975. She spent the next, I would say, 7 years like a magpie, sort of stealing ideas from think tanks or individuals. And that formed the basis of what we now know as Thatcherism. I think she always had an open mind, much more open than I think the narrative probably suggests. And she developed this public image which suited her, but was in some ways quite false, in that the Russians did her the biggest favour in 1977, calling her the Iron Lady, and she lived off that really for the rest of her premiership. Because if you think about it at that time, and there are similarities here between her and Kemi Badenoch, I think, where when I was writing the chapter on her period in opposition, literally every couple of hundred words I was thinking, yeah, Kemi's got to deal with that. Not just building the policy platform, but the fact that she was the first woman leader, and I think in today's environment we underestimate how challenging that was. Her last party election broadcast in 1979 was her just looking at the camera for 10 minutes saying, it's going to be okay. I know you're concerned that I'm a woman and can a woman do the job. Well, I'm here to tell you I can. And a lot of people think that broadcast on its own, which in those days people did watch these broadcasts, that had a significant effect on the size of her majority. She wasn't the bull in a china shop conviction politician that sometimes she'd like to portray. One of the themes from the book is that she was actually a pragmatist. You look at trade union reform. She didn't go in all guns blazing. She appointed Jim Pryor to be Employment Secretary, a ruddy-faced Sussex farmer who was certainly not on her sort of planet in terms of the same place in the party. He was very much on the left of the party, sort of symbolised the Wets in a way. And there were 4 different trade union acts, or was it 5? I think it was 4, over the 11 years. And it was slowly catchy monkey. Similarly, they knew there was going to be a confrontation with the miners at some stage, but they weren't going to provoke one, and when it came, they were going to be ready for it. So, and when it came, they were ready for it. So I think, I don't really know what you mean by her state of mind in that sense, which is why I'm slightly floundering in answering the question. But I think you have to look very much beneath the surface as to what her public image was and what she was actually like as a leader and the Prime Minister.
Thank you, gentlemen, for a really interesting talk and exploration. As a historian, I find all of what you've said from different dimensions fascinating, and I was glad to speak with Andrew before. Obviously, we know in the early years Mrs Thatcher wasn't a Tory grandee and was hated perhaps or severely disliked by some of her cabinet. What do the archives particularly reveal about her minister's impression, and to what extent do her ministers change opinions of Mrs Thatcher perhaps in private, and in what way can we draw lessons for future leaders from that? Thank you.
I'm very deaf at the moment. I didn't need 10 seconds to have the question repeated. I just need my ears. Oh, gosh. A sort of non-answer coming up. A non-answer coming up. I was just very struck in the last week or so, sort of
backbenchers in the Labour government, sort of the rebels, people saying they'd never met or spoken to the Prime Minister. I mean, party politics aside, that surprised me because sort of in terms of sort of cabinet and party management, I know the late Iain Dale and others were constantly sort of organising backbench drinks and dragging backbenchers in to meet the Prime Minister. That may or may not have been comfortable. Those experiences may or may not have been pleasant for everyone. But there was a sort of mechanism for sort of, particularly in the tough times, and the first couple of years of Mrs T's government were incredibly tough. The resilience of people like Geoffrey Howe at the Treasury, it's before you were in Parliament, but you were on the scene. The resilience, I think, is just sort of runs through all these things. It's not a direct answer to your question, I think, but sort of resilience, internal party communications, I think would seem to be very good and very well organised, and all these things take time.
I believe there's a question here, and then there's one right on the back at your side.
My question is also sort of historian's question for Andrew. From your knowledge of the archives, if a young researcher came along to you and said, what aspect of the archive do you think there's something really interesting there which hasn't been written about as much as it could have been, what would you recommend, one or two topics which would enlighten people, which people would learn more from the archive than perhaps they might know now?
Oh, thank you for that.
I should say, so my name's Charles Pender.
It's a version of the question I sort of like but changes every day, which is your sort of favourite document. And that changes on a daily basis. It would be the sort of people round her, the advice she got, how she acted on it. People like Alan Walter's archive is with us. I mean, a very heavy-duty economist embedded in Number 10. At similar time, but slightly later, to John Hoskins running her first policy unit. And just to see how she engaged with that advice and sometimes ran with it with no acknowledgement, or on other occasions ignored it slightly. Inspired by listening to John O'Sullivan this morning, which I thought was great. I was reading something ages ago about the sort of Thatcher team going to Washington for the president's inauguration in February '81, and how the then administration was slightly sniffy about some of Mrs Thatcher's economic policies, rolling forward to the autumn of '87, after Mrs Thatcher had given Reagan great support over Iran-Gate, Iran-Contra. She writes this extraordinary letter to him, hectoring him effectively about the value of sound money. And I just
he
cannot
didn't
imagine...
take much notice, did he?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Hi, my question is, do you think her personality came from having a strong team and a dedicated team that was actually loyal to her, that didn't swap and didn't, it had been there for a while, so she knew she could delegate to these people? And that's what you haven't got at the moment? And that's what you need the stability behind?
No, quite the reverse. She had a cabinet which was dominated by the Wets, as was known, and I was very fortunate in that she came on another occasion to the No Turning Back group, and Eric Forth berated her. He said, why do you constantly promote your opponents and leave a majority of people who disagree with you in the cabinet? So you're constantly having to fall short of what you'd like to do. Why don't you why don't you promote some people here? And waving at the rest of us. And I subsequently got promoted. So I have been grateful for that. But she did. Well, partly it was wise, of course. You want to keep the people, as John Major said, inside the tent, relieving themselves outside rather than vice versa. But she was amazingly reluctant to promote the people who supported her. So she then found herself in difficulties. And even at the end, she had an enormous number of people in the cabinet who were not necessarily her most ardent supporters, nor necessarily the most able people in the party.
Can I just relate a quick anecdote related to Andrew's first answer? In 1985 or 6, I was working in the Commons for a little-known MP called Patrick Thomson, and I started a businessman's club in his constituency where they paid £100 and they get a dinner in the House of Commons. And I unfortunately used the phrase, with direct access to government ministers. These were in the pre-Sleaze days. And David Steele, who was then leader of the Liberal Party, he decided he would raise this at Prime Minister's questions one day, and this was unbeknown to me, and I was sitting in my office just getting on with my work. And Patrick came back later on, he said, well, I've had quite a day, thanks to you. He said, I was called in to see the Prime Minister, and she told him what David Steele had said. And she said, but don't you worry, Patrick, I'm going to give him a good going over, as I usually do. So I didn't get a P45 after all.
Unfortunately, I've got multiple people trying to catch my eye, but we've got time for one last question. Perhaps you could ask your question over lunch to the panellists. Last question, please.
We haven't really spoken about her as a woman. She was amazingly proud of her appearance. She always looked wonderful, her hair, her clothing and so on. And as Iain pointed out, she should have a weakness for a certain kind of good-looking man. In John O'Sullivan's brilliant explanation of the special relationship, of course, one of the things about the relationship with Reagan is that there was a sort of a kind of mutual attraction, but a kind of flirtatiousness. With your experience, can you say, how did she use her womanliness, do you think? I mean, it was a huge part of her. We've talked about her in theory, haven't we, really?
She would flirt. Simple as that. And there were some politicians in this country, actually particularly on the left, who were quite susceptible to this. She had quite a little gaggle of Labour MPs, quite left-wing ones, that she rather liked, and they liked her. They could never admit it, of course. Frank Field, Eric Heffer, to name but two. Who?
John Reid.
Oh, really?
No.
Didn't know that. You see, he doesn't really fit. He doesn't really fit the stereotype. I'm often asked, how would she deal with Donald Trump? Well, I don't know the answer to that question, I have to say. But would she be able to use her sort of feminine ways on Donald Trump? I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure he's absolutely susceptible to that. But this idea that she did nothing for women, when she broke the glass ceiling, I'd have thought that was quite enough for most people. But again, she did only have one woman in her cabinet, but there were only 17 female Conservative MPs to choose from, and half of them were barking.
I was just going to say, she didn't like flirting with men she found attractive, but she didn't like wasting time on spouses who she thought were irrelevant. My wife was a great fan of hers from before I even met her, and met my wife, that is. But when we went to number 10, she would, Margaret would say hello, and then use her handshake, which was yes, and move her on. And my wife got very annoyed, and then I'd be the next, and then she'd have a long chat with me. So my wife would then flirt outrageously with Dennis, who was in the line, and this got me moved on very rapidly.